It's only fitting today that we begin our tribute to a great American prophet by reading a passage on courage from Dr. King's book, Strength to Love. Courage is an inner resolution to go forward despite obstacles. Cowardice is submissive surrender to circumstances. Courage breeds creativity. Cowardice represses fear and is mastered by it. Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when we must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but one must take it because it is right.
Most of us here today remember the turbulent times of the civil rights movement in the early 1960s. Bill will be playing a short video as a reminder of what extraordinary courage was required of Dr. King as he put his body and life on the line to do what's right, while leading peaceful protests against segregation in the South.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
To Alabama Governor George Wallace, the continuation of segregation was a solemn promise. To Martin Luther King, it was a scourge he vowed to overcome. In the city of Birmingham, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, whose church and home had been bombed because of his activism, began a campaign to integrate the downtown shopping district. King joined him in March of 1963. They both expected an extreme response from Public Safety Commissioner, segregationist Eugene Bull Connor.
One of the good fortunes of the civil rights movements were its enemies. Where could you find a better enemy than Bull Connor of Birmingham?
King submitted to arrest on April 12th, Good Friday, to draw maximum press coverage. Attorney General Robert Kennedy had asked King to avoid confrontations with police, wanting to pursue civil rights gains through the courts, not the streets.
Dr. King said, Mr. Attorney General, I can best serve this country and my people by focusing on the evils of segregation. He said it's a corruption of the society. It's a corruption of the soul.
Sitting in his jail cell in Birmingham, King wrote about that corruption. He responded to an open letter that appeared in the Birmingham News that same day. It was titled A Call for Unity and was signed by 8 white clergymen. Their appeal made reference to outside leadership, calling the protests unwise and untimely. King wrote in the margins of that newspaper, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. He went on, Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of brutality is widely known. The sentiments King expressed in the letter had already made an impact on students who had committed themselves to civil rights activism throughout the Deep South.
We were greatly influenced by Martin Luther King Jr. and the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. But we didn't like the tempo of change. We wanted to speed it up.
It's me, oh Lord, standing in the need of prayer.
On May 3rd, students re-energized the campaign. Some were in high school, others were even younger. The Birmingham campaign became known as the Children's Crusade.
It was easy for black students like myself in the South to say, well, if they can do it in Little Rock, they can do it in Montgomery. If they can stand up, we can stand up too.
Connor and the police
When Bull Connor ordered the police to disperse the protesters with dogs, it was clear this was a real battle, a violent confrontation. Firemen were ordered to use the full force of their hoses on the demonstrators. The local newspapers supported Bull Connor's response, blaming the chaos on the demonstrators.
I really believe he thought somehow in some way that he would scare us. But he didn't understand the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. He didn't understand the spirit of the movement.
Television and newspaper reports captured the brutality in Birmingham and showed it to the whole nation. Outside the region, it was shocking. It was horrifying. It was unacceptable.
It brought the civil rights movement into people's homes, with many American families watching the 6 o'clock news in such a way that it simply just couldn't be ignored.
In just a week, the demonstrators' nonviolent response created a public outcry that Birmingham could not dismiss. On May 10th, symbols of segregation, like separate water fountains, became relics as city leaders signed the Birmingham Truce. In addition, a plan was agreed upon to desegregate lunch counters. This was the kind of meaningful negotiation Martin Luther King had called for in his letter. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. These words had inspired citizens young and old to take direct action in the streets of Birmingham. The letter was soon published in newspapers and magazines, and its power was undeniable. King had gone to Birmingham to fight injustice. In the end, his most powerful weapon was the letter he wrote from the confines of a jail cell.
So, in April 1963, Martin Luther King was in a jail in Birmingham, Alabama, put on ice for leading demonstrations protesting segregation. While there, in the midst of this psychological winter, he wrote a letter, much of it written in the margins of newspaper, his only paper available, a reply to an open letter signed by 8 white Alabama clergymen, 2 Episcopal bishops, 2 Methodist bishops, a Catholic bishop, the chair of the Presbyterian General Assembly, a rabbi, and a Baptist pastor. The purpose of their letter was to speak against the demonstrations protesting segregation. In 7 paragraphs, these clergymen asserted 4 points. 1, they called for strict adherence to obeying the law, most especially to adhere to court orders prohibiting the demonstrations, which they called, as we heard, unwise and untimely. 2, they described the demonstrations as led by outsiders, and they called instead for negotiations among locals only. 3, they argued that nonviolent demonstrations actually incited hatred and violence, because with no demonstrations, no violence. And 4, they praised the calmness of law enforcement so far to date. To my reading, 60 years later, I find myself asking, to whom were these clergymen speaking? Their arguments certainly represented the position of white Birmingham moderates, but they offered nothing to the segregated black residents. Their letter was white people talking to white people, reassuring themselves their arguments smugly comprehensive to themselves. Their social and political dominance placed them in their own echo chamber. So from their point of view, they were talking to everyone who was really important. Anyway, Dr. King was listening deeply. Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail is his uninvited reply. 39 paragraphs, 6,000 words, 8 major points, written in longhand. King dealt systematically with what I would call the sophistries presented by these white clergy. First, he laid out his standing as not an outsider, but as someone connected to the Southland, to Alabama, and to Birmingham. Then drawing up and enlarging on the interconnectedness of us all. And then he pivoted. Beyond this, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Eloquently, he compared his arrival in Birmingham to the itinerant prophets of Judaism and the wandering apostles of Christianity. Then he presented the framework of nonviolent campaigns with its 4 steps: determination of injustice, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. He noted that all 4 steps had been completed in Birmingham. Self-purification, by the way, involves asking ourselves the question, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? And are you able to endure the ordeals of jail? The last step, direct action, that is, demonstrations, were in response to failed negotiation. As King said, for years I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. Martin Luther King then turns to the argument about following law and court orders. He distinguishes between just and unjust laws. We can never forget that everything Hitler did, this quote, we can never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. Then, unquote, then King directly addresses the white consensus in the clergyman's letter. Quote, I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed by the white moderate. Shallow understanding of people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding of people of ill will, unquote. Then even more directly, he says, I have been disappointed by the white church and its leadership, unquote. His point, the open letter from these 8 clergymen did not trouble themselves to say that segregation was morally wrong. Then King turns the screw harder. Quote, if the church of today does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authentic ring, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning in the 20th century. In his closing, King makes 3 more points. 1, the cause of desegregation does not need the white church to succeed. 2, Birmingham police have not been calm. They have been violent. Attack dogs, fire hoses, physical violence to demonstrators, inhuman jail treatment. 3. He wished these clergymen had commended the Negro demonstrators for their courage, willingness to suffer, and amazing discipline. For me, this is a mic drop moment. "60 years later, alas, much of King's letter still rings, still resonates, still rhymes. Racially motivated shootings in Charleston, Buffalo, and Georgia. Stand your ground laws exonerate white shooters 17 times more than black shooters. A month after the inauguration of Obama in 2019, white boy rage launched the Tea Party movement. In 2016, this rage elected Trump. In 2017, Trumpists vilified immigrants. On January 6, 2021, white boy rage attacked the Capitol and, alas, continues to be much on display in our daily dose of the national news. The 2013 Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court decision, written by the so-called moderate Chief Justice John Roberts, essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This case has opened the door to all sorts of shenanigans, with gerrymandered districts, voter suppression legislation, election denialism, really defining our entire election landscape today. In 2018, Attorney General Jeff Sessions justified child separation at the border by invoking Romans 13, quote, to obey the laws of the government, unquote. I wonder if he even knew that Romans 13's ugly racist history, invoked routinely, blithely by the white church fathers to justify police violence against civil rights demonstrators. As far as churches becoming irrelevant social clubs without meaning in the 21st century, I'd like to believe that remains an open question. Martin Luther King seriously considered becoming a Unitarian Universalist. He found a lot to like about UU. UU was his ally on civil rights, but in the end, King concluded his becoming UU wouldn't resonate with the black community, what with UU being so white, disconnected from history, and grumpy about Jesus. And if you read the proposed 8th UU principle and the proposed UUA text called Article 2, if you read it informed by this mirror that Martin Luther King held up, we understand better how UU is trying to grapple with these issues, trying to remember itself, trying to renew itself. Maybe we can do something about some of this anyway. Getting outside of our own echo chamber, that's surely part of it. This may be as simple as attending UU General Assembly this year, listening to UUGA this year, and caring about our local community, listening to our seniors, farm workers, and homeless, becoming educated in mental health resources, learning to listen, and voting consistently, even when it's inconvenient, encouraging others to vote consistently, religiously, even when it's inconvenient. That's surely part of it. Joanne Rakowski and her work with Vote Forward provides us all with a role model here. There are many streams flowing into one river, standing up, being present, because injustice is here. Such are my thoughts on this winter's day after the rain, inspired by Martin Luther King's letter, written in cursive by his jailed hand from his big free heart in early 1963, not so long ago, really. Amen. Now let me play an extract of Martin Luther King's reading his letter from Birmingham jail, about 2 minutes worth. I encourage you to listen to the entire YouTube video, which is 52 minutes long.
I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge of this decisive hour. But even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no despair about the future. I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham, even if our motives are at present misunderstood. We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation, because the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with America's destiny. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before the pen of Jefferson etched the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence across the pages of history, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored in this country without wages. They made cotton king. They built the homes of their masters while suffering gross injustice and shameful humiliation. And yet out of a bottomless vitality, they continue to thrive and develop. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We will win our freedom, because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands.